Hello and welcome everybody to the People Strategy for the Future of Work virtual conference. This is our fifth session today, and today we are speaking with Dr. Ilene Ringler, who is going to talk to us about difficult conversations, a manager's guide. Hello.
Good morning to you and to all of you out there, wherever you are. Looking forward to the next hour. I think it's going to be very interesting for us all.
One more thing before you begin, everybody, if you will put your where you're coming from and what you're eating for lunch. I would like to know what you're going to have for lunch today. Put that in the chat. And if you have any questions during our presentation, feel free to add them to the chat or Q&A. We will be monitoring both. All right, take it away.
All right. So good morning. And well, good morning here. I am in sunny Phoenix. I'm wearing my chilly vest, so everybody can see that I'm actually in sunny Phoenix, and looking forward to sharing the next hour with you. Here is our agenda. An overview of how we're going to be working together, the session objectives. I'll give you a little bit more introduction about myself, and we're going to go through an easy, hopefully to follow process to learn how to be more comfortable with difficult conversations, and especially with those that you have with employees, which seem to cause us just so much angst and heartburn on a regular basis. Final review and Q&A, and we will both be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions that you want to ask, I don't know, can they unmute themselves?
If they raise their hand, I can allow them to talk and they will unmute themselves. Yes.
Great. Okay. And I'll be following the chat as well. And that way we can be looking at questions and answering them as they come along. So here's an overview. We have all had difficult conversations and we all lose sleep. Not sure how many of you, and you can raise your hand or fess up when you know you're anticipating one of these conversations. 3 a.m., you sit bolt upright in bed and you say, oh my God, this is going to be awful. So we want to be able to establish right away that these conversations will never go away. There is never going to be a time when we're all out there, especially from an employee and manager perspective, always singing Kumbaya. We're going to be learning about a 3-step process that has many individual pieces and parts to it that will help you be more confident when you're preparing for difficult conversations. Our focus here will not be debriefing huge amounts of new information because there's so much great information out there now, but on practical steps and the sharing of best practices. So learn about a 3-step process. I have a very large background in total quality, and in my training, they always said, don't give them more than 3 steps. You could put 80 million steps under each one of those 3, but any more than 3, people get nervous. So you will see a 3-step process that will help you prepare and successfully navigate the difficult conversations as a manager. What we'd love to have you do, just on the side as you're working along, is to identify an example of a difficult conversation that you will be having or one that you have had with an employee. So as we go through this process, you can work through it and see where you had strengths in the different areas, where you have places where you would need to maybe practice more or prepare more to work through the process. And we're going to talk about action planning for yourself. So this is me. Now, as you can see, this is not me, but the headshot is so good that I share it with everybody because even on bad hair days, I always look wonderful. So this is me, Dr. Ilene Ringler. I have had over 30 plus years in the adult learning and organizational development space for large and small corporations like Fidelity and Oracle, and even small ones like SmartBridge, and have enjoyed them all. And I have also been teaching for over 20 years, both on ground and online. And currently I am going into my 18th year with Purdue University Global. We're in the MBA program in the School of Business and Information Technology. And my focus is on leadership and business growth. So let's get right into conversations. Some basics. What is it? Like, before we even go any further, what does Merriam-Webster tell us is a conversation? And this is important. An oral exchange And the word exchange is really critical here, especially when the conversation is going to be difficult, of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas. And we spend almost our entire waking day, and sometimes at night, if we talk with ourselves, when we're getting prepared for this difficult conversation, we're in conversations of all sorts, face to face. In Miriam's original definition, it was oral. But we have made it a lot more difficult because we're not just doing oral, we're doing virtual, we're doing emails, we're doing texts. So we have to be able to prepare for all of the different kinds of conversations that we have, as well as how we have them, because preparation is going to be key to the successful exchange. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of our hour, how to make sure we can do that. So let's think about this. Can you, I am personally a proponent of remembering when things went well, because you're more likely to keep those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of best practices than the stuff that didn't go so well. So can you think about a time when you had a conversation and it went well? And can you think about a time when it didn't go as well, and why? And I'm going to kind of be in the chat here as well. Anything about, had a late breakfast of bacon and eggs. Oh, very good, Paul. I didn't even see that before. My husband grinds me Dunkin' Donuts fresh every morning. So that is my breakfast beverage of choice. So can you think about a time when you had a great conversation? And can you think about a time when it didn't go so well, especially from an employee perspective? I managed large teams globally, and there was just so many times when I said, wow, this employee is having a performance issue and I need to know how to handle it. And without training, oftentimes it didn't go so well. So I had employees who turned me into HR, and I was HR for not going through the process very well. So think about that for yourself. And if you're comfortable in the chat, kind of list them there, or just keep them in your head, because it's important to know what went well and what didn't go so very well. And looking at those examples in your head, we can look at the 3-step process. Again, formulate, follow through, and follow up. Very catchy. And all the steps underneath that will help us gain more confidence in preparing. Why is step 1 important? How many times have you gone in and just done step 2? And fess up, I know that many times I talk to people, I counsel managers, and even in my classroom, I counsel people who say, look, I just want to get this over with. And then they go into the conversation and they say, that didn't work so very good. So it is very, very critical to think about your plan. I'm on my 4th. I'm thinking a cup of coffee. Okay. So I am urging you to really pay a lot of attention to step 1, because that is where we're going to be on our time frame this morning, spending the most time. So formulate. There's a couple of steps in formulate. Diagnose the problem and the people, because they're different. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to set some goals and measurements, and then talk about why we want to set goals and measurements. We're going to build a vision and talk about why it's important to build that vision, and create a detailed action plan. And this is all before you go anywhere near the conversation. So as you think about conversations that went well and ones that didn't go so well, I would suspect when you look at the steps and formulate, you probably did quite a few of these. And you're saying to yourself now, wow, I'm thinking about this is why this went so well. So let's diagnose the problem first. Why do we need to look at the problem first, as opposed to the person, as opposed to going into the conversation? Why do I need to look at the problem? Because oftentimes, at least in my experience, and probably in your experience, you aren't necessarily sure what problem you are trying to solve. you might see evidence of causes of the problem. You might see what happens when the problem is impacting other people, but do you really know what the problem actually is? And that's going to be the most important piece. And there's lots of good techniques to do that. We're going to talk about some of those. And some additional questions to ask yourself is, all right, I see this problem. Not sure really what's happening here. And I'm asking myself, was this problem always here? Did something change? Did I change? Did a policy change? Did an employee's lifestyle change? When did the problem start? And possibly, why did the problem start? And those factors are going to be very critical in creating your action plan. So if it was just, gee, in the last week, the employee was doing X, or gee, the employee's significant other have a critical event, you need to be looking at the landscape of what is happening around yourself and around your department and the organization as a whole to see why these behaviors might have been occurring. So, and I see Stephanie says, I never thought of it like that before. Sure, it's, everything kind of cruises along, and then all of a sudden, bam, in the middle of nowhere, the employee who was wonderful is not so wonderful anymore. And the conversations like this are not necessarily only confined to performance appraisal time, they're all the time. So things you need to be thinking about are what was and now what is, and how that impacts the problem that I am trying to solve. This is going to be a critical first step, because everything after that is going to be based upon the results of this part. So let's do a little bit of sharing of best practices. What tools have you used to diagnose a problem? My favorite, I'll start off, is the 5 whys. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the 5 whys, but well, why is this employee acting inappropriately? And you might come up with something. Well, why is this inappropriate behavior starting on this particular day? Or why is this day and time problematic? So anybody, when they're doing problem diagnosis, and it could be on anything, maybe there's some doctors here that could give us some tools, think about tools that you might have used either in your personal or your professional life to diagnose a problem. So I, again, use quite a bit of the diagnosis tools that come with the total quality management philosophy, cause and effect diagrams, the 5 whys, contingency diagrams, talking with other people. So tools is not necessarily only something that you write down, but do you look at others who might be peers to you? Do you look at your manager as a tool? Do you look at HR as a tool? So think about the times when you have been successful diagnosing a problem, and then ask yourself the question, what did I do in order to make that successful? So we will be looking at the chat as you might be thinking about putting some of your practices, best practices, and how did the use of the tool increase your confidence? So question, a spinoff of the 5 whys where he coaches employees, and what else? Oh, that is absolutely wonderful. So it's engaging others in diagnosing the problem. So thank you for sharing that, because there are so many tools out there that I didn't want to give you a million of them, because you probably use some of them right now. So the use of whatever tools you could find to help you diagnose that baseline problem are going to be helpful to you. All right, then the people. And there are 2 parts of the people. So you and others. So why do you have to diagnose you? Because you might be part of the problem. What if you changed your behaviors? What if you had an event in your life that caused you to be doing things differently? What if you, and I'll give you a good best practice, a good example here. I have a manager who I just love to death, wonderful guy, has my back all the time. And every once in a while, he gets crabby. I don't know why he's getting crabby. He just gets crabby. So if he gets crabby, then there are ways that that impacts me and how my behavior then changes to impact others. So you have to look at yourself and say, all right, what roadblocks have I had conducting difficult conversations in the past based on my own behaviors? Am I not able to look at the person in the face? Do I cry? I have talked to managers who say, I can't do this because I feel so bad that I start to cry. What about me might be causing the problem? So you need to take a mirror and look at yourself in the mirror and say, could this problem be part of anything that I have done differently? So did the type of conversation and format impact where the conversation was difficult? So if I was going to have a difficult conversation in my office with a door, if they still have those anymore, and that went pretty good, but I couldn't have it around the water cooler, or I couldn't have it in another place that I wasn't feeling comfortable, I might also be causing that piece of the problem. So in the chat, if you like, what have you done to overcome difficulties? When the problem is you, or partially you, what tools and resources have you used to increase your success? Just for the lack of anything else, I know before I go into a difficult conversation, I have to eat, and I have to have had a good night's sleep, and I have to have gone to the restroom before I go into the difficult conversation, because I know those things will sit on my head. So think about the times when your conversations have been successful. Think about when they haven't been and the roadblocks that might have been caused by you. And those are part of your diagnostics for the problem. Right. And if I were you, I'd be writing this all down. I was going to create a worksheet for you folks, but nobody uses worksheets anymore. But it might be wise to be taking some notes and saying, this is a really good point. I know that when I have to deal with an employee who might be older than me, or who might be reporting to me and who I used to report into, I have to have this conversation, and I don't like it. So writing down these things as you go through the workshop today are going to be very helpful for you. Then you're going to diagnose the others. And that's not just the person with whom you're going to be having this conversation. It might impact the entire department. So diagnose the people. Why is this conversation going to be difficult for them? So you have to really be thinking about, well, maybe they don't know they have a performance issue. Have any of you ever had a conversation with an employee, or have had a conversation conducted with you where you were like completely blindsided? Well, I didn't know this was a problem. I'm knowing it now, and I'm shocked and I'm upset. Or if you were talking to an employee about this and they were clueless and they didn't know, or they won't be talking to you because they're so shocked they can't talk to you. So think about, from a planning perspective, others. Is this your first time talking to this person or people? So the dynamics will change if it's the first time, as opposed to if it's multiple times around the same problem. What do you know about them? Do you know if they have family? Do you know culturally what it is that they believe are good cultural norms? Do you know, and this is going to sound odd, but do you know how old they are? Do you know what generation they come from? Because the different generations have very different expectations around communications. So right now, I'm a boomer, and I told Jacqueline today that my 70th B-Day is going to be next month. And if I have to talk to a Gen Y-er or a Gen Z-er, I have to really think about what I'm going to say, because their communication skills are very different than mine. So what areas of their background could you use more information on? So if in fact there are cultural constraints, and this is going to be very important if you're working internationally, it's like, wow, what do I need to know more about them? And do you know what their preferred communication style is? Some people like stuff in writing. Some people like stuff listening. Some people like stuff visually. You have to do that diagnostic to make sure that as you're preparing, you have the best foundation possible. So goal setting and measurement. So you've looked at the conversation, you've done some diagnostic work, and then you need to do some goal setting. Why do we need to set goals? Why do we need to set goals for anything? And why do we need to have measurements and desires for achievements? How do I know if there's been a successful conversation? Now, many of you, given that difficult conversations are difficult, might be out there saying, well, I'm just glad to get out of there. So I'm really happy. That's my goal. I'm getting out of there alive. The employee's getting out of there alive. There's no crying. There's no violence, because that could be taken into account. So, and in your regular workaday job, you set goals for performance, even though they get measured probably once a year or maybe quarterly. You need to set goals for this conversation. And the goal might be, I have had an interim conversation with the employee where they know what the problem is. And that was my goal. That might be the whole goal, to get the performance issue out on the table. And I know that I have done that because the employee has said to me, I will be working on an action plan. So it could be something very simple, but you have to have goals, because otherwise, how would you know if what you've done is actually working? So does anybody have goal setting tools? Do any of the organizations that you work for have goal setting tools? And you could use those. Most of the time, you have them for performance appraisals annually, but does anybody have goal setting tools that they might want to share that have worked well for yourself? I use lots of PERT charts, milestone charts for my goal setting tools. So I have the interim steps and the measurements to get to the final goal. I do a lot of work with process mapping, so I know, and flow, so I know how things are going to go. And that's how I set my goals. So think about the tools and the measurement processes that are in your organization today, or in the organizations that you've worked with in the past, and share them, if you'd like, in the chat, so that everybody gets a chance to see what you've done that's worked well. And when you use them, think about how much they're going to increase your confidence when you get to the actual conversation. All right, so vision creation. Now, this might seem really odd to you, coming after setting goals, but visioning is actually creating a picture or a movie in your own mind of how I want this thing to go. So I don't know how many of you, let's see, our company's just launching the use of goals mod. Very good. KPIs. Thank you so very much. It's so important to have those tools and to actually use them, and to use them a lot, because using them once isn't going to make you totally competent in them. It's going to give you a first shot. So why do you want to create a vision and formulate? So that you can see how the conversation is going to go. And for me, I'll just do an offside example here. I am a golfer, and I am known as one of the best putters around. Everybody wants to play with me. My goal is no more than 2 putts per hole. Try to get 1 putt per hole. And if I can see the ball going into the cup, for those of you who are golfers, I know that I have met my goal. So visioning is very important. And visioning is not only done by yourself. You might sit down with your goals and your measurements and talk them through with somebody else. A good peer, even your own manager, to say, look, I have this employee who's having some kind of problem. Here's what I want to achieve. Here's how I want to achieve it. Can I practice with you? Can I walk through with you how I'd like this to work? So has anybody ever used visioning tools for anything? I know that sometimes we do that when we start project teams. We create this vision. The organization has a vision. Has anybody used visioning in this application? I find that if I create a really clear vision and I start the movie playing in my head as I start to have that difficult conversation, I feel like my confidence is a lot better. So visioning is going to be important, but not upfront, although you can create one upfront if you want, but flesh it out as you're going through your planning process and use things like flow charts, use things like measurement charts to say, this is originally how I thought it was going to go. And now that I've done my analysis about the person, I've rehearsed it in my head, I see that things might not go the way my original vision was. And now I'm feeling like my confidence is a little lower. So if you have any best practices to share around vision creation, that would be helpful. I have known managers who have used vision boards, mind maps, those kinds of things. So they actually put the vision on paper and so they could follow it along. And I have known many people who have taken the vision and almost created the agenda for the meeting out of that vision. And it has that way, you know what the goals are, the person who you're talking to knows what the goals are. The more transparent you could be and the more actionable you could be and the more detail oriented you could be, the better off you are. So I don't know, Jacqueline, if there are any visioning types of tools in your toolbox that might be good to share as we're going through this and people can know more about them and take advantage of them. All right.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
We will. Okay. So detailed action plan creation. Why do you need, this is kind of like a duh. Why do you need to include action planning? Why do you need to include action planning for anything? It's the way that you can put closure on all of the work that you have done so far. So why do you need it? And how detailed do you need to be in action planning? Now, this is an important point because it goes back to your own analysis of the problem of you and or the person. So if in fact you know that you're going to have some difficulty with this conversation and you could be a potential roadblock, how are you going to put that into the action plan? Well, I feel my anxiety rising. Here is what I'm going to do to reduce my anxiety so that I can continue the conversation. And if you need to get that down to that level, do it before you even go and send the agenda out for the conversation, because it will help you increase your confidence. So have you used visioning sessions to reframe how a department? I have used them that way. So yes, a lot. And what's interesting about visioning, so I'm glad that you put that in the chat. Visioning is a lot harder than you think, because we tend to close our mind down to things that don't seem logical at the time, or things that might not seem rational, or things that might not seem acceptable. So yeah, visioning is going to be really important to work with an entire department. And visioning can be a difficult conversation if you really think about it, because people don't like change. So, an overall change in conflict behavior, people don't necessarily want to change their conflict management style. They don't necessarily feel comfortable working with conflict differently than they do now. So visioning is going to be important because it's going to be able to help create what the future state should look like. And that comes from the goal setting. So yes, visioning is going to be very important. And for you, you're going to need to create your own vision of what you want the outcome to be and how that whole thing's going to go before you can even do the visioning with the entire department. So the more you plan, the better off you are. So little best practice sharing, how do you action plan? Do you sit down with pencil and paper? Do you talk with other people? I'm a big proponent of Post-it notes. So I kind of create all the steps that I think, and it could be virtual Post-it notes. I take all the steps that I think I'm going to need to do, and then I move them around until they actually look right, which might not necessarily be the case, but they look that way. And then I go over them again. I run them by other people. you need to include every element you possibly can in order to be able to be sure that you could then confidently go forward. So you could involve others. I use my peers quite a bit. I actually use my husband a lot because he has a diametrically opposed thinking style to me. So when I run stuff by him, he comes up with things that I never, ever would have thought of. So you might want to action plan and review your action plan with somebody who could give you good feedback, who thinks in a very different way than you do. So tools in your organization. There's lots of good tools probably out there. Ask your boss, ask HR. They have wonderful stuff out there, and there is a ton. If there was no YouTube, I don't know what I would do. I mean, there's just a ton of wonderful stuff out there. There's stuff that Engagedly probably has. So the tools are out there. You just have to figure out which ones are going to be the best for you. So think about what has prevented you from creating and implementing action plans. That's going to be very, very important. So, oh no, I don't want to do that. I don't have the time. I don't really want to do this conversation anyway, so that if I do this action plan, it really means I have to do the conversation. You have to do it. So action planning is going to be key. So we have just spent a good deal of time on this first step. So can you see why it's so important to do all of this up front? So we're diagnosing the problem in the people, you and others. We're going to set goals and measurements. We're going to build a vision, and we're going to create a detailed action plan. So you can see that's why we spent so much time on this first step. So does this make sense to people? Did you learn something new? It's like, oh, geez, I didn't think about that. Steps are important, and following them is even more important. So hopefully you got some good new thought processes to use and can share those things with others. All right. We have done Formulate, creates the foundation. Next, and that's where we spent the most time. So the next is almost like cake, because what you're going to be doing is taking your action plan and implementing it. Agenda creation, location, 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 navigating emotions, and closing the conversation. So agenda creation. Why is it so important to create an agenda? How many times have you gone into a meeting of any kind where there is no agenda, and you look around the room and you say, this is going to be bad. This is not going to be productive. So the agenda is your way of extrapolating all of the information that you created in step one, so that you have a roadmap, you know what's going to be happening, and additionally, the person or people that you are going to be talking with know what is happening or know what is going to be happening, because probably, especially if it's a difficult conversation around a performance issue, they are going to need to assimilate that a little bit and come in prepared. So the agenda is what's going to be happening, how it's going to be happening, where it's going to be happening, why it's going to be happening. So that is, for those who use the total quality tools, the 5 W's and an H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who needs to be informed of the meeting and receive an agenda? And that could be you, the person to whom you're talking, HR, if in fact this is going to be a difficult conversation that they need to be aware of, your manager needs to be aware of all of this. And so they need to see the agenda. And this final question is, how much in advance of the meeting do you disseminate an agenda? And you know what? I do not have a 100% answer for that. It depends upon what comes out of the Formulate piece and where your action planning is. So if you are close to doing a performance action plan, and each organization has a different name for them. For an employee, that a performance improvement plan, the agenda might need to be sooner rather than later. Or if you're just looking to explore things with an employee around a one-on-one meeting with them that you might be having weekly or monthly, but you know there's some difficult items that you have to cover, you could do that days before. And you could be asking that person, are there any items that you think that you want to add to make this the most productive? So create that detailed agenda. Everybody will appreciate it. Remember the last time when you didn't have a detailed agenda and how that went? Now, the details should not preclude flexibility, but make sure you have it all down because it becomes your checklist when you go into that meeting. So does anybody have any best practices around agenda tools? Lots of times I know of people who say, we're going to have meeting X. What do you want to talk about? Because there might be information that comes back to you, especially somebody who talked a little bit earlier about visioning for changing conflict management practices. You might be sitting at an agenda that says, we want to talk about how to be more productively conflictive in our meetings or in our department. What do you want to have on the agenda? What do you want to achieve? Because it gives you a lot of really good information that you could add into your action planning. So have you allowed, if you have an agenda, have you allowed others to have input into it? And that way, you know where all the roadblocks and all the landmines could possibly be. So that writing it down, getting it out there. And if you're going to send an agenda via email, make sure that you have a read receipt on your email because somebody could come back and say, I never got it. So make sure that you have a read receipt on your email so you will know who read it and who did not. All right, location, location, location. Why is location so critical when you are having a difficult conversation? And it's going to change based upon what kind of conversation you're having. If you are going to be separating an employee, and that's a very difficult conversation, you're going to be having it maybe in a different place than you would if you were just having an initial performance improvement or a performance exploration discussion with the employee. So it's going to change. This is an important point here, our third bullet. Do you need to have an easy way to involve others or extricate yourself from the conversation depending on circumstances? Have you ever had a conversation with others and you sense that there's some danger, for the lack of a better word? You need to take that into account. I mean, I have had conversations with employees who get really upset. And I don't necessarily want to be there with them myself. Now, that's an awful thought to have, but you have to have an exit plan when you're going to have a conversation that could take a left turn that you don't know anything about. So how do you plan for location? It has to be where you're comfortable, and it has to also be where the employee or the person that you're having this conversation with be comfortable. So if the employee has never stepped into your office in their lives, and now all of a sudden you have asked them to come into your office, this is not comfortable. So go back to your Formulate as you're thinking about location. How do I make sure that this is a good location for this conversation to be concluded and concluded successfully? So location is going to be very important. I know that there are lots of companies that have spaces where it's a neutral territory, and there are many, many places that don't. So you need to be looking around and saying, what's going to be the best way for me to ensure that the conversation meets my goals? That's why you're doing goal setting in the first part of our Formulate. All right, navigating emotions. Do you know what triggers you to lose your objectivity when engaging in potentially emotional circumstances? Again, in my role as faculty, I get a lot of my mother is ill or my child is having issues, and that like triggers emotion to me, which might cause me to lose my objectivity, even if I don't know it's true. But I use my own experience to say, wow, that's really awful. So how do you know what triggers you? And you might not know that. So you might need to talk to others and say, how do I behave when I'm under stress? What happens to me? When do I cry? When do I get nasty? When do I get happy? So you have to be able to know what triggers your loss of objectivity, and you have to know what triggers others. And you might not know that because you might not know the person that well, or you might not have ever had a conversation that would do that. So that's why the visioning, the roadmaps, the steps are going to be important, because what if the person all of a sudden becomes emotional and you don't know how to handle it? How do you prepare yourself to be objective? Rehearsal. I find that rehearsal is very important for me to be able to get through those conversations. So think about times when you had difficulties, think about times when you were doing well, and make the good times more prevalent through the conversation. So scripts are very good. I use scripts quite a bit. I write them down and I rehearse them. And that way I'm not talking right off the side of my head, because there are going to be places where you have the script and then you have to speak contemporaneously. But as long as you have the script, you're in pretty good shape. So closing the conversation, it's done. Were your goals achieved? If so, why? And if not, why not? So that's why goal setting is so important, because you just don't want the conversation to end. You want to know, did you achieve your goals? If the goal was to have the employee leave without crying, if the goal was to have the person thank you for the conversation and offer to work on an action plan together, if. So you make sure that you have your goals in mind as you close the conversation. And you can ask the other person or people, this is what I had as goals for our conversation, because you're going to want to tell them that up front. Did we achieve those goals? If not, why not? What could we have done differently? Do we need to be talking more about this in order to make sure that the goals are achieved? Not very different than regular conversations that you might have at a project team. So any best practices that you use to close the conversation and ensure that everybody understood what transpired and agreed with the description of events. Now, for those of you who are using this for a performance appraisal application, employees don't have to agree with what happened, but they have to understand what it was. And that's going to be very important for you to double check and see that they understood. And because oftentimes this is emotional, they might not. And they might have heard you differently than what you thought you were conversing with them on. So very clearly, leave some time for the end of the conversation to do that review. Did we achieve this? What did you hear? What do you think are our next steps? And best practices, what processes have you used to ensure that they understood? So you might ask somebody to write up a synopsis for you, or you might ask them to repeat to you back what you said. And then again, best practices. If the conversation did not resolve the problem as planned, or additional conversations were needed, how did you work with this step, or how are you going to work with this step? Very important to ask yourself, well, we got 75% of this stuff done. How do I want to proceed? Because then you're going to have to go back to the formulate stage. Okay, here we go. Agenda, location, 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 navigating emotions. Always my big trip up is the navigating emotions, because I never think I'm going to get as emotional as I do, and closing the conversation. All right. Finally, we are going to improvement planning. So I'm sorry you have to drop, but I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and I'm glad that you learned something from it. So why do we need to do improvement planning? Why do you need to follow up? Because even though you're out of the conversation, that's not the end of it. You need to, behavioral change is tough. And for those of you who have these conversations, and then the problem comes back again, or the results weren't what you wanted, you have to do a diagnostic that says what happened, Why did it go well? Why did it not go so well? And what could I be doing differently? So follow-up steps, here they are. Assess goal achievement, both long and short term. So if in fact you want the other person to have behavioral change of this type, it takes months for behavioral change. And it takes months for it to cement permanently. It's not just a one-shot deal. So you're going to look at the goal achievement of the conversation, the goal achievement for the behavioral change that you're going to want from the other person. You're going to look at the quality of the people interaction. Did I leave feeling okay? Did they leave feeling valued and okay? There should never be a time in a difficult conversation where the person feels like they're not a human being. And so many conversations end up that way, which makes it a little bit problematic because they feel like they're a bad person. Well, no, you're not a bad person. It's just this is the behavior that needs to be changed, and this is what needs to be done differently, but you are a valuable individual. So you need to assess it from, did I make this person feel valued, and do I feel valued? And it then helps us also say, how can I follow up to be sure that the goals of this conversation continue to be implemented? So the person might make some early changes. Just real quick, how many of you have gone to a training course like this one? You've gone back to work and people look at you because you're doing stuff differently and they don't know why you're doing it differently and they don't applaud you for doing it differently. So you go back and doing it the old way. So you need to do follow-up to help cement the new behaviors. Or if the problem still exists, you need to see where additional work needs to take place. And you need to do some personal improvement action planning. How can I achieve greater success in the future and feel better about it in these conversations? So review your Formulate efforts, compare and contrast your results in reference to Formulate, what things went well. Never, ever do not assess what went well, because otherwise you'd be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Make sure you know what you did well, identify areas that need improvement or continued work, determine why things went well, because you want to know why you did them well, and then you want to know why things didn't go well. Create or revise your original plan and implement it. So we are heading towards the end of our time together. Think about tools that your organization has or Engagedly has that can help you do any part of this process. And revise your action plan. Was my action plan comprehensive enough? Do I need to do things differently? Did I have the right measurements? What could I have done differently in order to make the conversation more successful for the next time? So here we have, compare and contrast your results, identify strengths, areas that need improvement, and implement the revised plan. And we are done with all 3 steps. So in finalizing thoughts, conversations are a part of everyday life. They occur in many forms and circumstances, and for the most part are successful. It's the ones that you have trepidation about most times that don't go as well. So you need a solid process, and using the process will help increase your confidence, and that's the key. So Q&A, I think we've had some. I'll turn this back over to Jacqueline, and we're good.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. We did have one question that was regarding step 1, and that was that some folks may be neuroatypical, and they wanted to know if there were any techniques, if the same techniques would be effective for them, or if there's anything else they need to consider.
Well, I think that's a terrific question, and there are so many ways that people process information and assimilate information. And what would probably be good for you is to, as you're planning, look and see how people assimilate information and how they intake information, and then maybe go to HR or do some research on the web for different learning styles and different information processing styles. And do that for yourself as well, because you need to know how you communicate. You need to know how you process information in order to be able to put that into your action plan. So yes, that was a great, great question. So thank you.
And that's all the questions that we have. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, too.
Right.
So amazing presentation. Any last words for us?
No, I think plan is going to be my byword, and involve others as much as you possibly can. And I thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, wherever it is that you are.
Thank you so much. And for our participants, we have our next session, which is designing a winning employee experience, HR's blueprint. So if you are looking for the plan to win, this is the one that you need to be at. And don't forget that every session you attend gives you one extra entry to win the Stanley mug. So we'll see you at the next event. Bye.